The alarm clock died at 5:15, its battery giving out mid-beep, leaving only the hum of the refrigerator 2 rooms away. Marcus Reed opened his eyes in the darkness and knew immediately what time it was anyway. His body had learned the rhythm years ago back when Sarah was alive, and they'd wake together, her hand finding his under the covers before either of them spoke. He lay still for 30 seconds, no more. The ceiling was invisible in the pre-dawn black, but he'd memorized every crack in the plaster, every water stain from the leak 2 winters past that the landlord never properly fixed. His right shoulder ached where it always did, the legacy of too many years pushing industrial mops across marble floors, carrying buckets that grew heavier as the hours stretched. He was 42, but felt older in the mornings, younger by noon, when his body remembered what it was built for. The apartment was cold. November had arrived early this year, bringing rain that never quite stopped, just paused between storms. He could hear Mrs. Chen's television through the wall, always tuned to the Chinese language news station, always too loud. She'd been his neighbor for 4 years, and they'd exchanged maybe 20 words total, but he knew her schedule as well as his own. 5 a.m., she made tea. 5:30, the news. 6:15, she left for the restaurant where she worked 12-hour shifts 6 days a week. Marcus pushed himself up, feet finding the cold linoleum. The bedroom was barely large enough for the double bed and a dresser with a broken drawer that wouldn't close all the way. He'd meant to fix it for 3 years the same way he'd meant to do 100 small repairs that Sarah would have reminded him about with that particular smile. She had the one that said she knew he'd get to it eventually, even if eventually meant next year. The photograph sat on the dresser angled, so it caught whatever light came through the window. He didn't look at it as he pulled on his clothes. Looking made it harder, made the day start with the weight already on his chest. Instead, he focused on the routine jeans worn soft at the knees, a plain gray t-shirt, thick socks against the cold. His work uniform hung in the closet, the blue fabric darker where he'd scrubbed out stains that never fully disappeared. The bathroom mirror showed a face he barely recognized someday, not because it had changed, but because he'd stopped really seeing it. Dark hair going gray at the temples faster than it should. Eyes that had permanent shadows underneath, not from lack of sleep, but from the kind of tiredness that sleep couldn't touch. A jaw that needed shaving, but he'd do that tomorrow or the day after. Sarah used to run her fingers along his jawline when he let the stubble grow, said it made him look distinguished. Now it just made him look like what he was, a man too tired to care about things that didn't matter. He splashed water on his face cold enough to shock his system awake and brushed his teeth while staring at the grout between the bathroom tiles that had gone from white to gray, despite his best efforts. Some stains lived too deep to reach, no matter how hard you scrubbed. 5:43. Ethan would be awake in 17 minutes, give or take 30 seconds. The boy's internal clock was more precise than any alarm tuned to rhythms Marcus had spent years learning to read. The consistency was a blessing and a curse. It meant structure, predictability, the scaffolding that made Ethan's world manageable. It also meant no lazy mornings, no spontaneous lie-ins, no deviation from the patterns that kept his son from spiraling into anxiety, so intense it manifested in headbanging against walls and screams that sounded like physical pain. The kitchen was the largest room in the apartment, which wasn't saying much. Marcus had painted it yellow 2 years ago, thinking brightness might help, might lift some invisible weight. It hadn't, but he'd grown used to it. The cabinets were original to the building, probably from the 70s, laminate peeling at the corners. The refrigerator rattled and hummed, always on the edge of breaking down, but somehow persisting, held together by stubbornness and luck. He opened it and began pulling out ingredients with the mechanical precision of ritual. Whole wheat bread from the discount bakery 3 blocks away. Organic peanut butter, the only kind Ethan would eat, expensive enough that Marcus bought it instead of lunch for himself most days. Strawberry jam, the brand with the cartoon characters on the label. 1 apple small, slightly bruised on one side where he'd mark with the knife before slicing. The lunchbox waited on the counter, blue plastic with a cracked corner that Marcus had reinforced with electrical tape. The dinosaur on the lid had been drawn 3 years and 2 months ago, the week after the funeral when Ethan stopped speaking for 6 days straight. Sarah had drawn dinosaurs on everything: lunch bags, homework folders, the cast Ethan wore when he broke his arm falling off the playground equipment. She had a whole repertoire: T-Rex, Triceratops, Brachiosaurus with its long neck curved like a question mark. Marcus couldn't draw like she had, couldn't make the dinosaurs look alive and friendly. His lines were stiff, his proportions wrong, but he'd copied her T-Rex as carefully as he could, tracing the outline from one of Ethan's library books with a permanent marker that bled into the plastic. It looked nothing like Sarah's drawings. Ethan carried it every day anyway. The sandwich came together in stages Marcus no longer had to think about. 4 slices of bread because Ethan needed symmetry, needed even numbers. Peanut butter spread to within exactly 1 centimeter of the crust, no more, no less. Jam only on 2 slices, never all 4. Cut diagonally, never straight across, never in rectangles. Each half wrapped separately in wax paper, not plastic wrap, because the texture of plastic made Ethan gag. The apple took longer. He cored it, first removed every trace of seed and stem, then sliced it into crescents thin enough to be translucent when held to the light. 10 slices arranged in 2 rows of 5, wrapped in a damp paper towel to keep them from browning. Ethan would eat exactly 8 slices, would save 2 for after school, would panic if there were 9 or 11 or any number that didn't fit his internal logic. Crackers came next, the wheat kind that came in stacks, not the round kind, never the round kind. Marcus counted out 12 and arranged them in 3 rows of 4. 2 for eyes, the rest forming a smile below a face that looked up from the lunchbox with bland contentment. He'd been making faces in lunchboxes for 3 years and still felt like an imposter. Still felt like he was playing at being Sarah, doing a bad impression of her care, her creativity, her ability to make even a paper bag lunch into an expression of love. The kitchen timer beeped, 6 a.m. exactly. Footsteps in the hallway, light irregular. Ethan moved like he was always slightly off balance, like the ground shifted beneath him in ways only he could feel. The neurologist said it was a proprioception thing, that his son's brain processed spatial information differently, that it wasn't painful or dangerous, just different. Marcus had learned to hear the difference between different kinds of footsteps. The shuffle that meant Ethan was still half asleep, the rapid patter that meant anxiety, the deliberate pace that meant he was counting steps, organizing his world into manageable numbers. Today, it was the shuffle. Good. Easy mornings were rare enough to be grateful for. Ethan appeared in the doorway wearing his school uniform, the same navy pants and white polo shirt he'd laid out the night before. 10 years old, but small for his age, thin in a way that made Marcus worry, despite the pediatrician's assurances that he was growing fine just at his own pace. His hair stuck up in the back, dark and unruly like Marcus's, and he wore his glasses slightly crooked because he could never quite get them to sit right. He didn't say good morning. Hadn't said good morning in 3 years, hadn't said much of anything, really. The diagnosis paperwork called it selective mutism, a symptom of the autism, the anxiety, the complicated knot of neurological differences that made his son who he was. The speech therapist said he could talk, his vocal cords worked fine, he'd spoken freely until age 7. Something had closed that door, locked it from the inside. Marcus had theories about what about loss and trauma, and a child's mind protecting itself the only way it knew how. He kept the theories to himself. Ethan walked to the table and sat in his chair, the one facing the window, the one that let him watch the street 4 stories below, where the early morning joggers passed and the bus stop gradually filled with people heading to jobs that started at 7. He folded his hands in his lap and waited with the patience of someone who'd learned that waiting was easier than pushing, that the world moved at its own speed, and resistance only made things harder. Marcus brought the lunchbox to the table and set it down in front of his son. Ethan opened it, studied the contents with the intense focus he brought to everything that mattered. His eyes traced the cracker face, the wrapped sandwich halves, the apple slices just visible through the paper towel. His mouth didn't smile, but something in his posture softened, a subtle relaxation that Marcus had learned to read as approval, as a wordless thank you. They ate breakfast to get there at the small table. Marcus, with his black coffee and a piece of toast he'd burn in the toaster oven, because he always forgot to check it. Ethan with his cereal in a specific bowl, with a specific spoon, milk added until it reached exactly halfway up the side. The television stayed off. Music stayed off. They ate in the quiet that most people found uncomfortable, but that both of them needed, the silence that felt like peace instead of absence. Through the window, the sky was beginning to lighten, not sunrise yet, but the deep blue that came before the color that meant the world was waking up, whether you were ready or not. Marcus watched the street below, watched Mrs. Chen emerge from the building with her canvas bag and her quick, determined walk, watched a taxi idle at the corner, waiting for a fare that hadn't appeared yet, watched the city stretch and yawn and prepare itself for another day of relentless forward motion. Ethan finished his cereal and carried his bowl to the sink, standing on the step stool Marcus had built when his son was 6, and everything in the apartment was too high for him to reach independently. He rinsed the bowl 3 times, no more, no less, and placed it in the dish rack at the precise angle he always used. Then he went to the living room and began his morning routine, the series of small rituals that prepared him for the transition to school, checking his backpack, counting his pencils, touching the door frame 4 times, checking the lock twice. Marcus washed the breakfast dishes and wiped down the counter and checked the time. 6:22. They needed to leave in 8 minutes to catch the bus that would take Ethan to the special education school across town, the one with the sensory-friendly classroom and the teachers trained in ABA therapy and the understanding that some kids needed different things, needed quiet corners and weighted blankets and permission to be different. He was pulling on his jacket when his phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Ethan's school from Mrs. Patterson, the classroom aide, who'd been working with his son for 2 years. Just confirming pickup time today. 2:45 as usual. Everything okay with Ethan this week? Marcus typed back with thumbs that were too big for the phone's tiny keyboard, always hitting 2 letters at once, having to delete and retype. Sarah had been the one who texted, who kept up with the school communications, who remembered to send in permission slips and lunch money and replies to the endless stream of forms and updates and requests for information. Marcus did his best, but it always felt like he was playing catch-up, always one step behind where he should be. Yes, 2:45. He's been good, sleeping okay, no incidents at home. He hit send and pocketed the phone. No incidents was the metric they used, the way you measured success when your child lived in a world that hurt him in ways you couldn't see or fix. A good day meant no meltdowns, no head banging, no screaming. A great day meant Ethan made eye contact once or twice, meant he completed his schoolwork without shutting down, meant he let Marcus hug him goodnight without going rigid in his arms. They left the apartment at 6:30 exactly, Ethan counting the steps down the 4 flights of stairs under his breath, Marcus carrying both their bags because Ethan needed his hands free for touching the banister on every 3rd step. Another ritual, another small piece of structure in a world that felt too big and too loud and too unpredictable. The November air hit like a slap, cold and damp, carrying the smell of rain from earlier and the promise of more to come. The street was busier now, people heading to work, to school, to whatever obligations pulled them from warm beds into the gray morning. Marcus and Ethan walked to the bus stop 3 blocks north past the bodega, where Marcus bought his coffee on days when he had an extra $2 past the laundromat, with its permanently fogged windows and its dryers that ate quarters past the vacant lot where someone had started building something 5 years ago, and then stopped, leaving only a foundation and some rusting rebar and weeds that grew tall enough to hide it. The bus came on time, which was rare enough to feel like a gift. Ethan got on first, showed his school pass to the driver, walked down the aisle to his usual seat on the right side, 3rd row from the back. Marcus stayed on the sidewalk and watched through the window as his son settled in, as he pulled out the small fidget spinner from his pocket and began the rhythmic motion that calmed him, that gave his hands something to do while his mind went wherever it went during these rides. Somewhere Marcus couldn't follow, couldn't reach, couldn't protect him from whatever internal storms gathered there. The bus pulled away, and Marcus stood watching until it turned the corner and disappeared. Then he checked his watch, 6:53, and started walking in the opposite direction toward the subway station 8 blocks south that would take him downtown to Sterling Tower, to his real life, the one he lived 45 hours a week in a blue uniform with his name stitched above the pocket. The subway platform was crowded with the early shift workers, the ones who cleaned office buildings and stocked grocery stores and served breakfast to people who made more in an hour than they made in a week. Marcus recognized some faces from his daily commute: a woman with tired eyes who always wore a hospital orderly uniform, a man with paint-stained hands who carried his lunch in a plastic grocery bag, a teenager who couldn't be more than 17 with a fast food restaurant logo on his shirt. None of them spoke. They stood in the fluorescent light, waiting for the train that was always delayed and always packed and always smelling like industrial cleaner and human sweat and desperation wrapped in resignation. The train came. Marcus squeezed in with everyone else, grabbed a pole sticky with someone else's breakfast, and stared at his own reflection in the window across from him as the subway lurched forward into the tunnel. The man looking back at him seemed like a stranger sometimes, like someone wearing a Marcus Reed costume playing the part convincingly, but not quite believing it himself. He got off at the financial district station and climbed the stairs into a world that felt like a different city entirely from the one he'd left behind. Here the buildings were glass and steel monuments to money, to power, to the kind of success that required expensive suits and Ivy League degrees and the right last name. Here the coffee cost $7 and came with foam art, and the sidewalks were cleaner because dozens of someones probably got paid minimum wage to keep them that way. Sterling Tower rose 47 floors into the gray morning sky, its facade all reflective windows that threw back the clouds that made it impossible to see inside unless you already belonged there. Marcus had been coming to this building for 6 years, since before Sarah died, since back when they'd talked about saving up for a house in a neighborhood with better schools, when they'd believed that hard work and careful planning could buy you a different life. The main entrance had revolving doors that were polished to a shine every single morning before the executive staff arrived. Marcus went around to the side entrance, the one marked deliveries and services, the one where people like him came and went without being seen by people who mattered. He swiped his employee badge, and the door clicked open. No one stood guard here. No one checked his ID. After 6 years, he'd achieved the invisibility that came with being part of the infrastructure, as noticed as the plumbing or the electrical system. The service area was painted industrial gray and smelled like cleaning supplies and cardboard. Marcus walked down the hallway to the custodial office, a small room with lockers and a desk where Bill Torres, the day shift supervisor, sat doing paperwork that Marcus suspected was mostly crossword puzzles and sports betting research. Bill looked up when Marcus entered, his face settling into the expression of vague acknowledgement he used for everyone. Late 50s belly hanging over his belt, permanently exhausted in that way that came from 30 years of managing people no one else wanted to deal with. Reed, you're early. Marcus checked the clock on the wall. 7:11. I'm on time. Early for you means on time. Bill went back to his paperwork. You're on 15 through 20 today. Corporate sent down another memo about the executive floors needing extra attention. Some big meeting later this week, board of directors or some shit. You know the drill. Marcus knew the drill. Extra attention meant the same work, but with management breathing down your neck, meant checking corners that were already clean, meant making sure no one important saw anything that reminded them the building didn't clean itself. He changed into his uniform in the locker room, the blue work shirt and pants that made him look like every other maintenance worker in every other building in the city. The shirt had his name embroidered over the left pocket, Marcus R. They never used full last names, like even that small piece of identity was too much for someone in his position. His cart waited where he'd left it the day before, loaded with the tools of his trade, industrial mop, with a telescoping handle yellow bucket, with wheels that stuck bottles of cleaning solution that made his hands crack and bleed in the winter rags that were white once and now were the gray of everything that couldn't quite get clean. He checked the cart methodically, making sure everything was there, everything was full, everything was ready. The routine was meditative, a way of transitioning from Marcus the father to Marcus the janitor, from the man who made lunchbox faces to the man who was invisible by design. He started on the ground floor at 7:20, the building still mostly empty except for security guards doing their rounds and a few early arrivals who moved through the lobby with coffee cups and briefcases and the focused intensity of people important enough to set their own schedules. No one looked at him as he mopped the marble floors in the lobby, creating neat parallel lines of dampness that would dry before most employees arrived. There was a rhythm to the work, a pattern he had perfected over years. Start at the far corner, work your way toward the entrance, overlap each stroke by exactly half, ring the mop every 6 passes to keep the water clean enough to actually clean, instead of just spreading dirt around. His shoulders ached by the third section, but he'd learned to ignore that, to push through it the way you push through anything that hurt, but wouldn't kill you. By 8 a.m., the building was filling up. Executives in suits that cost more than Marcus's monthly rent assistants, carrying tablets and phones, and the harried expressions of people managing other people's lives. Junior employees still trying to prove themselves by arriving early and staying late. They flowed around him like water around a stone, unconscious, automatic, their eyes passing over him without seeing him at all. He preferred it that way. Being invisible meant no one expected anything beyond the basic job, no one made small talk, no one asked about his life in that way people sometimes did when they wanted to feel good about acknowledging the help. He'd had enough of that early on, people commenting on how hard he worked, how they admired people like him, how their own grandfather had been a janitor, and it was honest work. The admiration always felt like pity, wrapped in a compliment, and pity was worse than invisibility. He finished the ground floor by 8:30 and moved to the stairwell, starting his climb from bottom to top. The building had elevators, obviously, but maintenance staff weren't supposed to use the main ones during business hours, and the service elevator was slow and unreliable and broke down roughly once a week. Stairs were faster anyway, and the exercise helped him stay ahead of the slow decline. He'd started noticing the way his back protested getting out of bed, the way his knees made small clicking sounds when he climbed. Each floor was essentially the same cubicles in the middle section. Offices around the perimeter for people important enough to have walls and doors, a break room with coffee machines and refrigerators and microwaves that no one cleaned except him, bathrooms that needed constant attention, because apparently successful people never learned to aim or wipe up their spills or throw away their trash. Floor by floor, Marcus worked through the morning, mopping, dusting, emptying trash cans, cleaning the coffee stations where people left their used pods scattered like evidence of civilization's collapse, restocking toilet paper and paper towels and soap and dispensers that were empty more often than full, because everyone used more than they needed because abundance made people wasteful. He saw the same faces on every floor, or faces that might as well have been the same, all of them wearing that expression of busy importance, of having somewhere to be and something urgent to do. They talked on phones, typed on computers, held meetings in glass-walled conference rooms where they gestured at screens and pointed at charts and made decisions that probably affected thousands of people they'd never meet. Marcus wondered sometimes what they decided in those rooms, whether they thought about the people their decisions affected, whether they ever looked at someone like him, and wondered about the life attached to the uniform, the person beneath the invisible role. Probably not. People mostly thought about themselves, about their own problems, their own struggles. He couldn't blame them. He did the same thing. By 10:30, he'd worked his way up to the 15th floor, the executive level where the real power lived. The carpet here was thicker, the air conditioning colder, the art on the walls and actual paintings instead of corporate stock photos. The people who worked on this floor had titles like vice president and chief something officer, had secretaries who guarded their calendars, had doors that stayed closed unless you had an appointment or enough authority to walk in without asking. The hallway was quiet this morning. Most of the executives probably in meetings or out at working breakfast where they made deals over eggs, Benedict, and mimosas. Marcus started at the far end, working his way down toward the corner office at the end of the hall, the one with double doors and a nameplate that read, Victoria Sterling, CEO. He'd seen her before, of course. Impossible to work in this building for 6 years and not see the person whose name was on the tower. She was tall, always dressed in suits that looked sharp enough to cut, always moving with the kind of purposeful intensity that suggested she existed in a state of perpetual urgency. She had dark hair pulled back severely, features that were more striking than beautiful, and eyes that Marcus had never actually met because she'd never actually looked at him. Not directly, anyway. He'd been in her presence dozens of times, cleaning the hallway outside her office, emptying the trash in the reception area, but her eyes had passed over him the same way everyone else's did, unseeing, registering him as furniture, as part of the building's functioning, but not as a person who existed beyond his utility. The sounds reached him before he could see anything, voices raised in what wasn't quite shouting, but wasn't calm discussion either. Marcus slowed his approach, uncertain whether he should continue or come back later, but his schedule said 15 through 20, which meant this floor, which meant he couldn't skip it without explaining why, and explaining would require admitting he had heard something he wasn't supposed to hear, which would make it his business when the whole point was to never make anything his business. He kept mopping, inching closer to the source of the noise. The double doors to Victoria Sterling's office were open halfway, which was unusual. Executives valued privacy, kept their doors closed, had secretaries who controlled access like border guards. An open door meant something had gone wrong, meant the usual protocols had broken down. The woman who stumbled out nearly collided with Marcus's cart. She was young, mid-20s, probably wearing a blouse and slacks that looked new unworn, the kind of outfit someone bought specifically for a job they wanted to impress. Her face was red and wet with tears that she wasn't trying to hide anymore, past the point where dignity mattered, operating on pure emotion and hurt. She didn't apologize for almost running into him, didn't acknowledge his presence at all, just rushed past toward the elevators, one hand clutching her purse, the other pressed against her mouth, like she was trying to hold back sounds that wanted to escape. Marcus watched her go, watched the elevator doors close on her tear-stained face, and felt the uncomfortable recognition of someone else's pain, the kind that reminded him there were people in this building who suffered in ways he couldn't see from his position on the edges. He turned back toward the office. Through the open doors, he could see movement, could hear a voice sharp and cold with anger. He should leave, should come back in an hour when whatever private drama was happening had resolved itself, should follow the unspoken rule that maintenance staff existed in a parallel dimension, present but not participating, witnessing but never interfering. But something kept him there, some instinct he couldn't name. He positioned his cart at an angle that gave him a partial view through the doorway while maintaining the pretense of working, dipped his mop in the bucket, began cleaning the same section of floor he'd already cleaned, making it look like he was just doing his job, too focused on the task to notice anything else. Two children stood near the windows, girls identical, maybe 8 years old. They wore matching school uniforms, white blouses and plaid skirts and patent leather shoes that reflected the overhead lights. Their hair was pulled back into identical ponytails so tight it must have hurt not a single strand out of place. They stood perfectly still, hands clasped in front of them, faces blank as untouched paper. Something about their stillness struck Marcus wrong. Kids didn't stand like that, naturally didn't hold themselves with that kind of rigid control unless they'd learned it was safer than moving. Safer than reacting, safer than showing whatever they actually felt. He recognized it because he'd seen it before in Ethan, in the way his son sometimes shut down completely when the world became too much, when the only defense left was to go somewhere inside where nothing could touch him. Victoria Sterling stood in front of them, and Marcus could see now why people found her intimidating. She didn't yell, didn't raise her voice to a volume that would carry into the hallway, but the coldness in her tone cut deeper than shouting ever could. Each word emerged precise and controlled and heavy with disappointment that felt worse than anger. Do you understand what you've done? That was the 12th tutor this year? 12, do you know how that makes me look? The girls didn't respond, didn't move. Their eyes stayed fixed on some point in the middle distance, looking at nothing, seeing nothing existing in whatever space they'd found that was safer than being present. You are 8 years old, 8, and you cannot behave for 1 hour, one single hour. What is wrong with you? Marcus's hands tightened on the mop handle. He shouldn't be hearing this. This was private family business, none of his concern. But he couldn't make himself move, couldn't make himself look away from those two small figures standing like statues while their mother's words landed like slaps. Victoria turned away from them, pressing her fingers against her temples like she was fighting a headache or trying to hold something in that wanted to get out. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted from cold to something worse, something tired and defeated and cruel in the way exhaustion made people cruel. Your father would be ashamed. One of the girls flinched, just barely, just a tiny twitch in her shoulder, but Marcus saw it from 20 feet away, saw the way the words hit her like a physical blow, saw the crack in that perfect stillness. Victoria didn't notice. She was already turning to her desk, already reaching for her phone, already moving on to the next problem, while her daughters stood frozen in the aftermath of what she'd said. Marcus forced himself to move, forced himself to turn away, to push his cart down the hallway, to pretend he'd seen nothing, heard nothing, witnessed nothing that demanded a response. He was a janitor. His job was to clean floors, not to intervene in situations that weren't his business, not to judge people he didn't know, not to let his own losses make him oversensitive to everyone else's pain. But the image stayed with him as he worked his way through the rest of the 15th floor. Those two girls standing so still, the way one of them had flinched at the mention of her father. The blankness in their faces that wasn't peace or calm, but shut down the kind of protective dissociation that happened when being present hurt too much. He finished the floor by 11:30 and moved up to 16, then 17, working through the afternoon with mechanical efficiency, his hands performing tasks his mind had memorized years ago, while his thoughts kept circling back to that office. Those children, that moment of cruelty wrapped in frustration, wrapped in grief. He couldn't begin to understand but recognized anyway. Lunch came at noon. Marcus ate on a bench outside the building, the same bench he'd claimed as his spot years ago, the one that faced the small plaza with its abstract sculpture and its fountain that never worked, and its collection of pigeons that had learned to beg for food from office workers who ate outside when the weather allowed. Today was too cold for most people, which meant Marcus had the space mostly to himself. He pulled out his lunch from his backpack, a sandwich identical to Ethan's, but without the careful arrangement, without the wax paper just slapped together in 90 seconds while he was making his son's. An apple already browning because he'd forgotten to wrap it in anything. A bottle of water that cost 79 cents from the bodega instead of $3 from the building's vending machines. His phone buzzed halfway through the sandwich. Marcus pulled it out, expecting another text from the school, but it was from a number he didn't recognize. He stared at it for a moment before opening the message. "Hi, Mr. Reed. This is Dr. Patel from the therapy center. I wanted to follow up on Ethan's evaluation last month. We have some recommendations for additional support services that might benefit him. Can you call me when you have a chance? Best time is between 2-4 p.m. Marcus stared at the message. Doctor. Patel was the developmental psychologist who'd been working with Ethan for a year. One of 4 specialists his son saw regularly: the psychologist, the speech therapist, the occupational therapist, the special education teacher. Each one cost money that insurance only partially covered. Each one required time he only partially had. Each one promised progress that came in increments so small Marcus sometimes couldn't tell if anything was changing at all. Additional support services meant more appointments, more co-pays, more hours trying to coordinate schedules and transportation and coverage for times when he couldn't be in 2 places at once. It meant more hope, probably more promises that things could get better if they just tried this new approach, this new therapy, this new intervention that research suggested might help children like Ethan. He'd call later. Added to the list of things he needed to do when he found time that didn't exist, call the therapist. Reschedule the dentist appointment he'd missed last week, fill out the forms for Ethan's IEP review, fix the leak under the kitchen sink, replace the light bulb in the bathroom that had been out for 2 weeks, sleep more than 5 hours, stop feeling like he was drowning. Marcus finished his lunch and went back inside. The afternoon passed in the same rhythm as the morning floors cleaned, trash emptied, bathrooms restocked, coffee stations tidied. He worked his way up through the 20th floor, pushing his cart with its sticky wheels, wringing his mop with hands that were raw from the chemicals, maintaining the careful invisibility that made his job possible. By 2:30, he was ready to head back down to finish his shift with a final pass through the ground floor lobby before clocking out at 3. He wheeled his cart to the service elevator and pressed the button, waiting for the grinding sound of machinery that meant the car was rising or falling toward him. The elevator took its time. Marcus leaned against his cart and pulled out his phone, checking the time. 2:37. He needed to leave by 2:50 to catch the train that would get him to Ethan's school by pickup time. Being late wasn't an option. The school required parents to be on time, had a policy about repeated tardiness, would call child services if they thought a parent was unreliable. Marcus had seen it happen to another family, watched them get investigated because they were 15 minutes late. 3 times in 1 month, watched them lose their son to foster care for 6 weeks, while they proved they weren't neglectful, just poor and working jobs that didn't care if their shift ended at 2:30 when their kid got out at 2:45. The elevator finally arrived. Marcus maneuvered his cart inside and hit the button for the ground floor. The doors started to close, then stopped. Someone had hit the call button on another floor. The doors opened at 15. Marcus's gut tightened with a premonition he couldn't name, a sense that something was about to shift, that the day was about to become more complicated than it needed to be. A woman stood in the hallway. Not Victoria Sterling this time, but her assistant, a thin woman in her 40s named Janet, who Marcus had seen countless times but never actually spoken to. She looked stressed, more stressed than usual, her hair slightly disheveled, her lipstick faded. "Hold the elevator." Her voice had an edge to it, the sound of someone operating past their limit. Marcus put his foot against the door sensor, keeping it open. Janet hurried inside, punching the button for the ground floor repeatedly, Like that would make it move faster. The elevator descended in awkward silence. Marcus stared at the floor numbers lighting up and going dark, 14, 13, 12. Janet stood rigidly beside him, radiating the kind of tension that Marcus associated with people about to break, or people who'd already broken and were barely holding the pieces together. At floor 8, she spoke without looking at him. "You were on 15 this morning. Did you see what happened with the tutor?" Marcus hesitated. The smart answer was no. The safe answer was no, the answer that kept him uninvolved and invisible and protected. But something in the way she asked, something in the exhaustion in her voice, made him answer honestly. "I saw her leave. She seemed upset." Janet laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "That's one word for it. She quit, walked out mid-session. 12th one this year. Mrs. Sterling is—" She cut herself off, seemed to remember who she was talking to, a janitor. Someone who didn't need to know about executive problems. Someone who probably didn't care. "It's been a difficult year. That's all." The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened. Janet walked out without another word, her heels clicking across the marble in rapid staccato that suggested she was already late for something else, already moving to the next crisis. Marcus stayed in the elevator for a moment after the doors closed again, processing what had just happened. 12 tutors in 1 year. 2 children who stood like statues while their mother told them their father would be ashamed. A woman who'd almost confided in him, who'd caught herself just in time, who'd remembered that he was just part of the infrastructure. He pushed his cart out into the lobby and wheeled it back to the custodial office, parked it in its designated spot, stripped off his gloves, logged his hours on the timesheet, changed back into his street clothes in the locker room. 2:47. He was going to be late. Marcus ran for the subway, taking the stairs 2 at a time, pushing through the afternoon commuters who moved with the slow inevitability of people who had nowhere urgent to be. The train was delayed, of course, stuck in a tunnel somewhere between stations for reasons the conductor didn't bother explaining. Marcus stood pressed between other passengers, checking his phone every 30 seconds, watching the minutes tick past. 3:02 when the train finally moved. 3:13 when he reached his stop. 3:19 when he burst through the doors of Ethan's school, out of breath, sweating despite the cold, preparing to apologize to Mrs. Patterson for being late again. But Ethan wasn't in the pickup area. Mrs. Patterson stood by the door with 2 other children, both waiting for parents who hadn't arrived yet, but his son wasn't among them. Mrs. Patterson saw him, and her face did something complicated. Relief mixed with concern, mixed with something else Marcus couldn't read. "Mr. Reed, I was just about to call you." Marcus's stomach dropped. "Where's Ethan? What happened? Is he okay?" "He's fine. He's in the sensory room. We just had a bit of a difficult afternoon." The sensory room was where they took kids who were melting down, who needed to be away from stimulation, who needed weighted blankets and dim lights and permission to fall apart safely. Ethan had spent a lot of time there in the first year. Less lately. Marcus had thought they were past the worst of it. "What happened?" Mrs. Patterson glanced at the other children, clearly not wanting to discuss it in front of them. "Can we talk inside Ethan's?" "Okay, I promise. He's calm now. We just need to go over some things." They walked through the school hallways, past classrooms decorated with student artwork and alphabet charts and motivational posters about trying your best. The sensory room was at the far end, a small space with soft mats on the floor and beanbag chairs and a tent in the corner where kids could hide when they needed to feel enclosed and protected. Ethan sat in the tent, barely visible through the partially open flap. Marcus could see his son's hands moving in repetitive patterns, the self-soothing stimming behavior that looked strange to people who didn't understand it, but that was as natural to Ethan as breathing. "What happened?" Marcus asked again, quieter this time. Mrs. Patterson pulled out a folder from a nearby shelf. Inside was a drawing on white paper done in crayon with the shaky lines of a child's hand. It took Marcus a moment to understand what he was looking at. 4 figures. A man, a woman, 2 children. The man was lying down, eyes closed. The children were crying, tears drawn as blue lines running down their faces. The woman stood separate from the others, turned away, her face just a blank circle. "Ethan drew this in art therapy today." Mrs. Patterson's voice was gentle, careful. "He hasn't drawn pictures of your family since the accident. His therapist thinks it's actually a positive sign, means he's processing, but it triggered something. He got very upset afterward, started crying, couldn't stop. We brought him here to decompress. Marcus stared at the drawing, at his wife's stick figure body lying on the ground, at the tiny figures of himself and Ethan frozen in grief that a crayon couldn't quite capture, but that Marcus felt in his chest like a reopened wound. How long? His voice came out rougher than he meant. About an hour ago. He's been calm for the last 20 minutes. I think he's ready to go home, but I wanted you to know what happened so you can watch for any after effects tonight. Marcus knelt by the tent opening. Ethan looked up at him, and for just a second their eyes met. His son's expression was exhausted, wrung out the look of someone who'd been somewhere emotionally intense and was still finding his way back. Hey, buddy, ready to go home? Ethan nodded once, crawled out of the tent, let Marcus help him stand, let himself be guided through the process of gathering his backpack and his lunchbox and his jacket from the cubby. Didn't resist when Marcus took his hand, which was unusual, which meant Ethan needed the touch, needed the tether to something solid and present. They walked out of the school together. Mrs. Patterson waved from the doorway, and Marcus managed to wave back, managed to maintain the appearance of someone who had things under control, who wasn't falling apart inside, who could handle his son's grief on top of his own without collapsing under the combined weight. The walk to the bus stop felt longer than usual. Ethan moved slowly, tiredness in every step, and Marcus matched his pace, didn't rush him. Let the silence exist between them without trying to fill it with words that wouldn't help anyway. They waited at the bus stop for 12 minutes. The sun was starting to set, that early winter darkness that came before dinner and made the whole day feel like it was ending too soon. Marcus watched the street, watched the traffic, watched his son standing beside him with his head down and his hands fidgeting with the zipper on his jacket, and felt the familiar hopelessness of wanting to fix something he couldn't reach, couldn't touch, couldn't make better, no matter how hard he tried. The bus came, they got on, took their seats, rode in silence. When they got home, Ethan went straight to his room without being asked, which meant he needed space, needed time alone to reset. Marcus let him go. Stood in the kitchen, staring at nothing. His mind stuck on the drawing, on those crayon tears, on the way his son's grief kept surprising him. Even after 3 years kept showing up in new ways, when Marcus thought they'd found all the ways there were to hurt. His phone buzzed. He pulled it out, expecting nothing important, but the name on the screen made him do a double take. Sterling Tower Security. He opened the text message, confusion mixing with anxiety. Mr. Reed, this is Ron Vasquez from Sterling Tower Security. We need you to come in tomorrow at 7:30 a.m. for a brief meeting before your shift. It's regarding an incident on the 15th floor. This is not disciplinary, just need to go over some protocols. See you tomorrow. Marcus read it 3 times, trying to figure out what incident could possibly involve him, what protocols needed discussing, why security was texting him after hours about something that supposedly wasn't disciplinary, but felt disciplinary in every word. The incident, the tutor, the open door, the 2 girls standing like statues. He'd been seen. Someone had noticed him in that hallway, had decided he'd seen too much, or been too close, or somehow crossed a line he didn't know existed. Marcus typed back a thumbs up emoji because he didn't know what else to say. Then he sat down at the kitchen table and stared at the photograph of his wife, at Sarah's smile that used to make everything feel manageable, and tried not to think about how much worse tomorrow could get. But sleep didn't come easily that night. He lay in bed listening to the sounds of the building, Mrs. Chen's television through the wall, someone's pipes rattling, traffic on the street below that never fully stopped. Ethan had finally fallen asleep after an hour of moving around his room, arranging and rearranging his possessions in patterns only he understood, finding comfort in order when emotions were too chaotic. Marcus stared at the ceiling and played through scenarios. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe they just wanted to clarify that he shouldn't have been in that hallway at that time. Maybe they'd tell him to adjust his schedule to come back to the 15th floor after hours when the executives weren't there to be overheard. Or maybe they'd tell him he was being reassigned, moved to night shift or to a different building, or let go with some polite fiction about budget cuts or restructuring. He'd seen it happen to other maintenance workers who'd been around too long, who'd seen too much, who'd become slightly more visible than was comfortable for the people who preferred to pretend they didn't exist. The alarm went off at 5:15. Marcus hit the button before it could wake Ethan, dragged himself out of bed feeling like he'd slept maybe 3 hours total. Made coffee strong enough to hurt and drank it black while staring out the kitchen window at the darkness that hadn't started lifting yet. He went through the morning routine on autopilot shower clothes, making Ethan's lunch with hands that moved through familiar motions, while his mind spun through anxieties he couldn't control. The cracker face looked lopsided today, one eye higher than the other, but he didn't have time to fix it. Ethan appeared in the kitchen at 6 exactly, same as always. Sat in his chair, ate his cereal with the same focused attention, gave no indication that yesterday's meltdown had happened or mattered or left any residue Marcus needed to worry about. Kids were like that sometimes, he'd learned. They could move through emotional storms and come out the other side fresh, while adults carried every storm with them forever. They left the apartment at 6:30, waited for the bus. Ethan got on. Marcus watched him settle into his seat, watched the bus pull away, then turned and walked to the subway with 20 extra minutes. He didn't want time that stretched and contracted strangely when you were dreading your destination. He arrived at Sterling Tower at 7:15. The security office was on the second floor, a small room with monitors showing camera feeds from throughout the building. Marcus had never been inside before. Maintenance staff dealt with their own supervisors, stayed in their own areas, didn't interact with security unless something had gone seriously wrong. Ron Vasquez was exactly what Marcus expected, ex-cop, probably with that particular bearing that came from years of authority, late 40s, stocky, with eyes that assessed everything out of habit. He stood when Marcus entered, gestured to a chair. "Mr. Reed, thanks for coming in early. This shouldn't take long." Marcus sat. His mouth was dry. He tried to read Vasquez's expression for clues about how bad this was going to be, but the man's face gave nothing away. "I'm going to be direct with you. Yesterday morning around 10:30, you were on the 15th floor outside Mrs. Sterling's office. Is that correct?" "Yes, I was cleaning." "And did you observe or overhear anything while you were there?" Here it was. The moment where telling the truth could cost him everything, but lying would definitely cost him everything. If they already knew what he'd seen and were just testing whether he'd be honest, Marcus chose truth. "I heard raised voices, saw a woman leave upset. That's all." Vasquez nodded slowly. "That woman was a tutor for Mrs. Sterling's daughters. She filed a complaint before she left, said the work environment was hostile, that the children were being mistreated." It's bullshit, obviously. Woman couldn't handle two smart kids who didn't want to be tutored. But we need to document everything. He pulled out a form from a folder on the desk. "I need you to make a statement about what you saw for the file. It's standard procedure when someone makes accusations like this. You want me to say I didn't see any mistreatment?" Vasquez met his eyes directly. "I want you to write down exactly what you saw. Nothing more, nothing less." Marcus took the form. "Read it." It was simple, straightforward, name, date, time, location, description of observed events. He picked up the pen and thought about those two girls standing like statues, thought about the cold voice saying your father would be ashamed, thought about how easy it would be to write, "I saw nothing unusual," heard nothing concerning, just standard office noise. But he wrote the truth instead. Not everything, not the parts that felt too private, too raw, but enough to be honest without being cruel. "I was on the 15th floor at approximately 10:30 a.m. I observed a woman later identified as a tutor leaving Mrs. Sterling's office in distress. She was crying. I heard raised voices from inside the office but did not hear specific words. I saw two children standing in the office. They appeared quiet and well-behaved." He slid the paper back across the desk. Vasquez read it, nodded, filed it away. "One more thing. Mrs. Sterling requested that we provide her with the name of any staff who were present during the incident. She wants to speak with you personally." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "Why, I don't know. I'm just relaying the message. She asked if you could stop by her office at 9 a.m. today. That's during my shift. She's aware. Bill's been notified. He'll adjust your schedule." Vasquez stood, indicating the meeting was over. Marcus stood too, his legs feeling unsteady. He walked out of the security office and down to the custodial area in a daze, trying to figure out why Victoria Sterling would want to talk to him, what possible reason she could have for summoning him to her office like he was someone who mattered, like he was someone she needed to address directly instead of through layers of management. Bill was waiting in the break room, coffee in hand, expression somewhere between annoyed and sympathetic. Security said you need to be on 15 at 9. Yeah, whatever this is about, try not to make it worse. Bill sighed. I don't know what you did, but Sterling doesn't usually ask to meet maintenance staff directly. That's either really good or really bad. I didn't do anything. Then you're probably fine. Bill didn't sound convinced. Just be polite. Say yes, ma'am. Don't volunteer information she doesn't ask for. Marcus changed into his uniform and started his shift early, working through the ground floor, and then the lower levels with mechanical focus, trying not to think about 9 a.m., trying not to imagine the conversation, trying not to let hope or fear take root, because both emotions seemed equally dangerous. At 8:45, he took the elevator to 15. The hallway was quiet, most offices still closed. Janet, Victoria's assistant, sat at her desk outside the double doors typing something with the fierce concentration of someone drowning in email. She looked up when Marcus approached. Your Reed, yes, ma'am. She buzzed the intercom. Mr. Reed is here. Send him in. Victoria's voice through the speaker, professional, giving nothing away. Janet gestured toward the doors. Good luck. Marcus walked through, his heart beating too fast, his palms sweating despite the cold building air. The office looked different in daylight, larger somehow, more imposing. Victoria sat behind her desk, and up close, Marcus could see details he'd missed from the hallway. The lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, the gray starting to show at her temples despite careful coloring, the tightness in her jaw that suggested she held tension in her body the way some people hold grief. She didn't stand, gestured to the chair across from her desk. Please sit, Mr. Reed. He sat, kept his hands in his lap, waited for her to speak first because Bill's advice echoed in his head. Don't volunteer, don't elaborate, just respond. Victoria folded her hands on the desk, mirroring his posture unconsciously. I understand you were present yesterday morning when Ms. Chen left my employment. Yes, ma'am. Security provided me with your statement. You said you heard raised voices but couldn't make out specific words. That's correct. Victoria studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she did something unexpected. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a folder, opened it, slid a photograph across the desk. These are my daughters, Emma and Lily. The photo showed two girls maybe a year or two younger than they were, now standing on a beach with the ocean behind them. They were smiling genuine smiles, their arms around each other, their hair loose and wind-blown. They looked happy. They looked like children who hadn't yet learned that standing still was safer than showing emotion. Marcus didn't understand why she was showing him this, what response she wanted, so he said the only thing he could think of. They're beautiful. They are. Victoria's voice softened microscopically. They're also grieving. Their father died 2 years ago. Cancer. Since then, they've become... She paused, searching for words. Difficult. 12 tutors have quit this year alone. I've tried therapists, behavioral specialists, every intervention the experts recommend. Nothing works. They act out. They're defiant. They make it impossible for anyone to help them. Marcus thought about Ethan's drawing, about those crayon tears, about how grief in children look different than grief in adults, but hurt just as much. Maybe they're not acting out. Maybe they're just trying to be seen. The words came out before he could stop them, before he could remember that he was supposed to respond, not offer opinions, not presume to understand situations way above his pay grade. Victoria's expression shifted. Not angry exactly, more surprised. What do you mean? Marcus knew he should backtrack, should apologize for overstepping, but something in her face made him push forward, instead made him risk honesty when silence would have been safer. I have a son, he's 10, he has autism. When he's upset, he doesn't always show it the way people expect. Sometimes he shuts down completely. Sometimes he does things that look like bad behavior, but are really just his way of saying he needs help and doesn't know how to ask for it. Victoria was quiet. Then, what happened to his mother's car accident? 3 years ago. I'm sorry. The words sounded genuine, not the automatic sympathy people offered when they didn't know what else to say. Marcus nodded, accepting them. Victoria picked up the photograph, looked at it for a moment, then put it back in the drawer. Yesterday afternoon, after Ms. Chen left, I found Emma crying in a storage room on this floor. Do you know which one, 15C? How did you know? Marcus hesitated. Then I found her there yesterday morning, before you fired the tutor. She was upset. I stayed with her until she was ready to go back. The silence that followed felt heavy with implications Marcus couldn't read. Victoria's expression was hard to interpret, cycling through emotions too fast to track surprise, concern, suspicion. Something else underneath it all that might have been relief or might have been fear. You stayed with my daughter, alone, in a storage room, without anyone's knowledge or permission. She was crying. I didn't think it was right to leave her by herself. Did you touch her? No, ma'am. Did you speak to her? A little. I mostly just sat with her. She talked about missing her father. Victoria's jaw tightened. What did she say exactly that she missed him? That she wasn't bad? That she just, Marcus stopped uncertain how much to share, how much was his place to reveal. That she what? That she just wanted to be seen. To matter. Victoria stood abruptly, walked to the window, stared out at the city below. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, strained with something Marcus recognized as the sound of someone barely holding themselves together. I've spent 2 years trying to keep this company running, trying to prove I can do my husband's job as well as he did. Better, maybe. I've worked 18-hour days. I've fought off board members who wanted to replace me. I've sacrificed everything to show I'm strong enough, capable enough that losing him didn't destroy me. She turned back to face Marcus, and for the first time he saw past the executive armor to the person underneath the woman who was drowning in responsibilities and grief, and the impossible task of being everything to everyone while falling apart inside. And in the process, I've forgotten how to be their mother. I've let strangers raise my children. I've let them suffer because I was too busy surviving to notice they were barely surviving too. Marcus didn't know what to say. This felt too intimate, too raw, like he was witnessing something he shouldn't like. She'd forgotten he was maintenance staff and was confessing to someone she thought would understand. Yesterday, Emma asked me why I don't love them anymore. Victoria's voice cracked. 8 years old, and she thinks I stopped loving her because she's too difficult, too damaged, too much trouble. You do love them. Of course I love them. But loving someone and being present for them aren't the same thing. I've learned that the hard way. She walked back to her desk, sat down, became CEO again, the moment of vulnerability closing like a door. Here's what I'm proposing, Mr. Reed. I want you to spend time with my daughters, not as a tutor, not as a therapist, just as someone who's present, someone who listens. Ma'am, I'm not qualified to. Neither am I, apparently. Victoria cut him off. But Emma responded to you. In 10 minutes, you did what 12 professionals couldn't do in a year. You got her to stop crying. You got her to feel safe. Marcus thought about his son, about his afternoon schedule, about the impossibility of adding more responsibility to days that were already stretched too thin. I have Ethan. I can't leave him alone after school. Bring him, if that's what it takes. The offer hung in the air between them, impossible and tempting and terrifying all at once. Marcus thought about the extra money, about how far $500 a week could stretch, about the therapy appointments he'd been delaying, because the co-pays added up, about the field trip Ethan's class was taking next month that he'd told his son they probably couldn't afford. But he also thought about the risk, about spending time with children who weren't his, about the way good intentions could be twisted into something ugly, about anonymous complaints and investigations, and losing everything he'd built because someone decided he'd overstepped boundaries that weren't clearly marked. Victoria seemed to read his hesitation. I know this is unconventional. I know it's asking a lot. But I'm out of options, Mr. Reed. My daughters need someone who sees them as children instead of problems to fix. You've already proven you can do that. How long? 2 weeks. Trial period. 2 hours a day after your shift ends, 5 days a week. I'll pay you $50 an hour. If it doesn't work, we end it, no hard feelings. Marcus did the math again. $1,000. Money that could change his month, his year, his ability to give Ethan the support he needed. What if it goes wrong? What if someone complains, says I'm overstepping, says we'll cross that bridge if we come to it? Victoria's voice was firm. But I'm willing to take that risk if you are. My children are more important than my reputation, than this company, than anything else. It took me 2 years to remember that, but I remember it now. Marcus looked at her, really looked at her, and saw someone as desperate as he was in a different way. Someone trying to hold together broken pieces with nothing but hope and determination and the belief that maybe, just maybe, caring enough could make a difference. Okay, the word came out before he could second guess it. 2 weeks. Thank you. Victoria's shoulders relaxed fractionally. Come to my house today at 4. I'll give you the address. And Mr. Reed, yes, ma'am. Call me Victoria. We're going to be spending a lot of time navigating complicated territory together. We might as well use first names, Marcus nodded. Stood walked toward the door in a daze. His hand was on the handle when Victoria spoke again. Mr. Reed, Marcus. He turned back. Thank you for staying with Emma yesterday. Thank you for seeing her when I wasn't looking. The words hit him harder than they should have struck, something deep that ached in recognition and relief in the particular pain of being acknowledged when you'd spent years being invisible. You're welcome. He walked out of the office past Janet, who studiously avoided looking at him down the hallway to the elevator, trying to process what had just happened, what he'd just agreed to, what complications he'd just invited into his carefully managed life. His shift passed in a blur of automatic movements, his hands cleaning, while his mind spun through scenarios and worries and the faint thread of hope he was afraid to pull too hard, because hope had a way of unraveling when you needed it most. At 2:30, he left the building and caught the train to Ethan's school. His son was waiting in the usual spot, calm today, no aftermath from yesterday's meltdown visible in his face or posture. They rode the bus home together, and Marcus explained carefully using the simple declarative sentences Ethan processed best that they were going to go somewhere different today, to someone's house to spend time with some other children. Ethan's face closed down the way it did when change was being introduced, when his routine was being disrupted. But he nodded the small gesture that meant he understood, even if he didn't like it, that meant he'd try even if trying was hard. They got off the bus 10 blocks from their apartment in a neighborhood Marcus rarely visited, where the houses had yards and the streets had trees and the cars parked along the curbs cost more than he made in a year. Victoria's house wasn't a mansion, wasn't the ostentatious display of wealth he'd half expected. Just a large 2-story brick house with shutters that needed painting and a front yard that needed mowing, and the general air of a place where people lived instead of just showing off. Victoria answered this door herself, dressed in jeans and a sweater, instead of her usual suit, her hair down around her shoulders instead of pulled back severely. She looked younger like this, more human, less like an executive, and more like a mother who was tired and scared and doing her best. Marcus, come in. She stepped aside. And this must be Ethan. Ethan didn't look at her, stood half behind Marcus, his hand gripping the edge of his father's jacket, needing the anchor of touch to navigate this new situation. He doesn't talk much. Marcus kept his voice low, calm. He has autism. New places are hard for him. That's okay. Victoria's tone matched his understanding without pity. Emma and Lily are in the living room. Take your time. They walked through the house, Marcus cataloging details automatically. Hardwood floors that creaked underfoot, family photos on the walls, children's drawings held to the refrigerator with magnets, the ordinary evidence of lives being lived. The living room was comfortable, not magazine perfect, with a couch that showed where and bookshelves overstuffed with novels and picture books and photo albums. The twins sat on the couch wearing casual clothes that somehow still looked formal on them, their hair down, but still neat, their posture still too careful. When they saw Marcus, something shifted in their faces. Not quite a smile, but a softening, a recognition. This is Ethan. Marcus guided his son forward gently. He's going to hang out with us for a bit. Ethan didn't acknowledge them. Walked to the corner of the room and sat down on the floor, pulling his box of Legos from his backpack with the focus that meant he was building a wall between himself and the unfamiliar, creating safety through ritual. Emma watched him with curiosity. Lily looked skeptical. Marcus sat in a chair near the window and waited, understanding that forcing interaction would break whatever fragile possibility existed in this room. 5 minutes passed in near silence. Then Emma stood and walked slowly toward Ethan, moving carefully like you'd approach a wild animal, like she understood instinctively that sudden movements would scare him away. What are you making? Ethan didn't answer. Kept building his hands, moving through practiced motions, creating something complex that only he could see in its finished form. Emma sat down a few feet away, far enough to not intrude, close enough to show interest. I'll just watch. Lily joined her sister, settling cross-legged on the floor, and Marcus felt something unlock in his chest, some tension he'd been holding release slightly. These children understood each other in ways adults couldn't manufacture, recognize isolation and pain, and the need for space in each other because they carried it themselves. Time moved strangely in that room. Marcus couldn't have said if 15 minutes passed or 45. He just sat and watched his son build while two grieving girls sat nearby in companionable silence, all three of them existing together without needing words to fill the space. When Ethan finally finished his tower, intricate, geometrically precise, beautiful in its complexity, he sat back and looked at it with the satisfaction of completion. Then he did something Marcus hadn't expected. He pointed to his box of Legos, then to Emma. The gesture was clear, your turn. Emma's face lit up with something that might have been joy, or might have been the surprise of being included, of mattering to someone, even in this small way. She picked up a handful of pieces and started building her creation, smaller, simpler, but made with careful attention. Lily joined her, their hands working together, and when they finished a lopsided structure that barely stood, Ethan studied it seriously. Then carefully, deliberately, he placed it next to his tower. Equal, valued, accepted. Emma smiled for real this time, not the careful expression she wore like armor, but a genuine smile that transformed her face, made her look like the girl in the beach photograph, like the child she would have been if grief hadn't taught her to hide. Marcus felt his throat tighten. He glanced at Victoria and found her standing in the doorway, watching her hand pressed against her mouth, tears running silently down her face. Their eyes met across the room, and something passed between them, some shared understanding of what this small moment meant, how rare and precious it was to watch broken things begin to fit together. The afternoon ended with reluctance, with Ethan carefully packing his Legos, while the twin asked if he'd come back tomorrow, their voices small and hopeful and careful not to push too hard. Marcus promised they would promise 2 weeks at least, and saw relief flood their faces. Victoria walked them to the door. Thank you. Her voice was rough from crying. Tomorrow at 4. Tomorrow at 4. The walk to the bus stop felt lighter somehow, like something heavy had been set down, like possibility had opened, where there'd been only resignation. Ethan walked beside him without needing to hold his jacket, a small sign of comfort, of being okay. That night, after Ethan was asleep, Marcus sat at the kitchen table and stared at the photograph of Sarah. He hadn't spoken to it in 3 years, hadn't let himself pretend she could hear him, but tonight he whispered to the image, I think I did something good today. I think maybe we're going to be okay. The photograph didn't answer. The silence was complete. But for the first time in 3 years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like permission to move forward, to let new connections form, to build something from the wreckage without betraying what had been lost. Tomorrow would bring its own complications, its own challenges. But tonight, where Marcus let himself believe that sometimes broken people could help other broken people heal, and sometimes that was enough. The second afternoon began with rain threatening and clouds that hung low and heavy over the city. Marcus arrived at Victoria's house with Ethan at 4:03, 3 minutes late, because the bus had been delayed by construction on 7th Avenue. He expected Victoria to comment on the tardiness, expected the CEO precision he'd seen in her office. But she just opened the door with flour on her hands and something that might have been relief in her eyes. The girls are in the kitchen. We're making cookies, or trying to. The kitchen smelled like butter and vanilla and something burning. Emma stood on a step stool at the counter, measuring flour with intense concentration, her tongue between her teeth. Lily sat at the table with a mixing bowl, stirring with mechanical determination, her arm moving in circles that never varied in speed or arc. Neither of them had made cookies with their mother in 2 years, Victoria explained quietly. She'd found the recipe in an old drawer that morning, her husband's handwriting on the index card, and decided some things were worth burning. Ethan gravitated toward Lily, watched her stir for a full minute before sitting at the table across from her. He pulled out a small notebook from his pocket, the kind with graph paper, and began drawing geometric patterns with a pencil he had sharpened to a perfect point. Lily glanced at his work between stirs, her rhythm never breaking, but her eyes tracking the lines he made, the symmetry he created. Emma abandoned her flower to peer over Ethan's shoulder. That's really neat. How do you make it so even? Ethan flipped to a blank page, handed her the pencil, guided her hand with his own to show her the technique. No words passed between them, but communication happened anyway. The kind that existed beneath language, in gesture and patience, and the willingness to share space without judgment. Marcus stood against the refrigerator, trying to be present without hovering, trying to find the balance between supervision and trust. Victoria worked at the counter, shaping dough into balls that were supposed to be uniform, but varied wildly in size, proof that perfection wasn't the point, that effort mattered more than outcome. The cookies came out of the oven, misshapen and overdone on the edges, underdone in the middle disaster by any reasonable standard. Emma declared them perfect anyway. Lily ate 3 without comment, which Marcus was learning meant approval. Ethan touched one, broke off a small piece, ate it in tiny bites that took 5 minutes to finish. Progress. They moved to the living room after cleanup. The 4 children settling into the same positions as yesterday, but closer now, the distance between them shrinking by increments. Emma asked Ethan about his school, seemed fascinated, when Marcus explained about the sensory room, about the weighted blankets and the dim lights and the permission to be different. We should have something like that here. Emma looked at her mother with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. Somewhere to go when everything is too much. Victoria's face did something complicated. We can make that happen. The afternoon ended with Emma drawing in Ethan's notebook, her lines less precise but enthusiastic, and Lily asking Marcus about his job in the careful way children ask questions when they're testing whether adults will tell them truth or comfortable fiction. Do you like cleaning buildings? It's honest work. It pays the bills. It lets me take care of my son. But do you like it? Marcus thought about the question, about the years of invisible labor, about finding dignity in work that other people dismissed. Sometimes. Mostly I like that when I'm done with a floor, it's clean. There's satisfaction in finishing something, in making something better than you found it. Lily nodded, slowly processing this. My dad used to say work was only worth doing if it mattered to someone. If it made a difference, your dad was right. The girl's eyes met his directly for the first time. I think you make a difference. The words hit Marcus square in the chest, unexpected and profound and achingly sincere. He managed to nod, to accept them without diminishing them with false modesty or deflection, and saw something shift in Lily's expression. Trust being built brick by careful brick. Day 3 brought sunshine, cold and bright. Victoria had a meeting that ran late, texted Marcus to let himself in with the key under the turtle planter by the front door. He found the girls doing homework at the kitchen table, struggling with math problems that were clearly beyond them, frustration evident in Emma's crossed-out attempts and Lily's rigid posture. Ethan looked at the worksheets over Emma's shoulder, pointed to a problem, then to his own notebook. He worked through the solution methodically, showing his process in neat rows of numbers, and Emma's face brightened with understanding. Within 20 minutes, they'd formed an impromptu study group, Ethan demonstrating techniques. Without speaking, the twins learning not just math, but patience, the value of breaking big problems into smaller, manageable pieces. Marcus watched this unfold from the living room, where he was helping Victoria sort through boxes of her late husband's belongings she'd been avoiding for 2 years. Photographs, papers, a watch that had stopped working, a coffee mug with a joke printed on the side that wasn't funny anymore. She held each item with reverence and pain, deciding what to keep, what to let go, what to give her daughters when they were old enough to want pieces of their father they could hold. He collected baseball cards. Victoria held up a binder full of them, plastic sheets protecting cardboard rectangles that meant nothing to Marcus but had meant everything to someone. The girls don't care about them, but I can't throw them away. It feels like throwing away part of him. Maybe put them in the attic. Not throwing away, just storing until they mean something to someone again. Is that what you did with your wife's things? Marcus thought about the bows in his closet and about Sarah's clothes. He couldn't donate her books. He couldn't read her jewelry. He'd someday give Ethan when his son was old enough to understand what it meant to inherit love in physical form. Some of them, others I kept out. Reminders that she was real, that we were real, that losing her doesn't mean she wasn't here. Victoria set down the baseball cards and pressed her palms against her eyes. Some days I can't remember his voice. I try to hear it in my head, and it's gone, just static where his words should be. And I hate myself for forgetting. You're not forgetting him. You're just making room to keep living. There's a difference. The conversation was interrupted by laughter from the kitchen, bright and sudden and shocking in its normality. The 3 children had abandoned homework for a game involving Ethan's pencil and a complex set of rules only they understood, and the sound of their joy felt like evidence that healing wasn't linear, but it was possible that grief could coexist with happiness, that broken things could learn to hold new shapes. Day 4 was Saturday, which meant no school for Ethan, which meant Marcus brought him to Victoria's house in the morning instead of the afternoon. They found the twins still in pajamas, eating cereal in front of cartoons, looking like regular children instead of the careful constructs they'd been performing. Emma's hair stuck up in the back. Lily had marker on her hands from drawing something the night before. Neither of them rushed to present perfect versions of themselves, and Marcus understood that this comfort, this letting down of guards, was progress more significant than any behavioral checklist could measure. They spent the morning in the backyard, raking leaves that had fallen from the oak tree and needed clearing before winter made them impossible to manage. The work was physical satisfying in its simplicity, and the children approached it like a game rather than a chore. Emma made piles to jump in. Lily organized them by size. Ethan arranged them in patterns before raking them into bags with an efficiency the girls tried to emulate. Victoria made lunch sandwiches cut into quarters because she'd noticed that's how Marcus made them, and they ate outside despite the cold, wrapped in jackets and scarves, breathing clouds into November air. The conversation was easier now, less careful, the children comfortable enough to talk over each other, to disagree about which cartoon was best to include Ethan, in debates he participated in through nods and headshakes, and occasional writing in his notebook when simple gestures weren't enough. After lunch, Victoria suggested they make thank you cards for Marcus and Ethan for spending time with them, for being patient, for caring when they'd learned to expect people to leave. The girls threw themselves into the project with the intensity children brought to expressions of feeling they couldn't voice directly. Emma drew elaborate pictures of the four of them as stick figures holding hands. Lily wrote careful paragraphs about how different things felt now, how the house seemed lighter, how maybe they weren't as broken as they'd thought. Ethan made a card too, unprompted, his drawing showing 5 figures instead of 4, including Victoria showing all of them together in front of a house that could have been hers, or his, or some imagined place where families reformed themselves around new configurations of love. When they left that afternoon, Emma hugged Marcus goodbye for the first time, her small arms tight around his waist, her face pressed against his stomach. Lily hung back but offered her hand to shake, formal and solemn, and somehow more meaningful than her sister's spontaneous affection. Different children showed care in different ways, and Marcus was learning to read both languages. Day 5 began with a phone call at 6 in the morning before Marcus had finished making lunches before the day had properly started. Bill Torres's voice tense and formal in a way that made Marcus's stomach clench with premonition. "Reed, don't come in today. Ron Vasquez needs to see you first thing. Security office at 7. What's this about?" He didn't say, just said it's important. The line went dead. Marcus stared at his phone, at the black screen reflecting his own worried face, and knew with the certainty of experience that something had gone badly wrong, that the careful peace of the last week was about to shatter. He called Ethan's school to arrange late arrival, explaining that he had an emergency meeting, promising his son would be there by 9. Ethan didn't understand the change in routine started the hand flapping that meant anxiety rising, and Marcus had to spend 20 minutes calming him, explaining in simple terms that sometimes schedules change, that it would be okay, that they'd adapt. The security office felt different this morning, hostile in a way it hadn't been before. Ron Vasquez sat behind his desk with another man Marcus didn't recognize, a younger wearing a suit that marked him as someone with authority beyond building security. The stranger's eyes were cold and assessing, looking at Marcus like he was a problem requiring solution. "Mr. Reed, this is David Chen from Human Resources." Vasquez's voice was carefully neutral. "We need to ask you some questions about your arrangement with Mrs. Sterling." Marcus sat in the chair. They indicated, his hands gripping his knees, trying to keep his expression calm, while his mind raced through possibilities, through ways this could go wrong, through consequences he couldn't afford. Chen opened a folder that seemed too thick for something that had only been happening for 5 days. "We've received a complaint, anonymous but detailed. It alleges that you've been spending time alone with Mrs. Sterling's minor children outside of your professional capacity as maintenance staff. Is that accurate, Mrs.? Sterling hired me to spend time with her daughters. She approved it. She's paying me. Do you have that arrangement in writing?" Marcus's mouth went dry. "No, it was verbal. And these sessions take place at Mrs. Sterling's private residence." "Yes, with her children. Unsupervised. I wouldn't say unsupervised. Mrs. Sterling is present." Every time Marcus hesitated, most times, "She's usually there." Chen made a note in the folder. "Mr. Reed, are you aware that 3 years ago there was an investigation into your wife's death? It was a car accident. I was cleared. The investigation noted concerns about your ability to care for your son, questions about whether the stress of single parenting might have contributed to your wife's distracted driving that night." "That's not." Marcus's voice came out harder than he meant. "That's not what happened. She hit a patch of ice. The police report confirmed it. I wasn't even in the car. But you were investigated. Chen's tone was relentless. And now you're spending unsupervised time with vulnerable children who've also experienced loss. Can you understand how that looks? The room felt too small, the air too thick. Marcus understood exactly how it looked, had known this risk from the beginning, had taken it anyway because he'd believed helping mattered more than protecting himself. He'd been wrong. I haven't done anything inappropriate. I've been helping these children, giving them someone to talk to, someone who understands loss. That's admirable, but it's not your job. Chen closed the folder. Until we complete our investigation, you need to stop all contact with Mrs. Sterling's children. No visits, no phone calls, no communication of any kind. If Mrs. Sterling contacts you about this arrangement, you direct her to me. Understood? For how long? Until we determine whether company policies have been violated, whether there's any risk to Mrs. Sterling's children, whether this arrangement is appropriate to continue. Marcus felt the world tilting, felt the ground dissolving beneath him. These girls needed consistency, needed to know people wouldn't abandon them. And here he was being forced to do exactly that, to disappear without explanation, to prove every abandonment, fear they'd ever developed, completely justified. Can I at least explain to them why I'm not coming back? Can I say goodbye properly? No contact means no contact, Mr. Reed. Chen stood, indicating the meeting was over. We'll be in touch within the week with our findings. In the meantime, you'll return to your normal custodial duties. Bill has your updated schedule. Marcus walked out of the security office in a daze, his body moving through motions while his mind struggled to process what had just happened. He called Victoria from the subway platform, got her voicemail, left a message that tried to explain, without explaining, that said something had come up, that he couldn't make it today, that she should call him. She called back during his shift, her voice tight with controlled anger. What investigation? What complaint? Who would do this? I don't know. Chen said it was anonymous. This is James Hendrick. Victoria's certainty was absolute. He's been trying to force me out for 2 years, looking for any weakness, any scandal he can manufacture. And now he's using my children against me. Marcus didn't know who James Hendrick was, didn't understand board politics or corporate warfare. But he understood being collateral damage, understood being used as a weapon against someone else. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make things harder for you. You didn't do anything wrong. We didn't do anything wrong. Victoria's voice was fierce. I'm not letting them end this. My daughters need you. They've made more progress in 5 days than in 2 years. I'm fighting this. The call ended with Victoria promising to handle it, promising to call lawyers and human resources, and whoever else needed calling, promising Marcus that this wasn't over. But her promises felt hollow against the institutional weight of investigations and policies and the careful protection of a company more concerned with liability than with what was actually right. Marcus finished his shift in mechanical silence, mopping floors that didn't need mopping, cleaning bathrooms that were already clean, trying not to think about Emma's hug, about Lily's handshake, about the trust he'd earned, and was now breaking through no fault of his own. He picked up Ethan from school at the regular time, his unsensing something wrong in the way children always sensed adult distress, becoming clingy and anxious in response. They rode the bus home together, Marcus staring out the window at the city passing by, at people living lives that seemed simpler than his own, at the illusion of normalcy he'd briefly believed possible. His phone buzzed with a text. Victoria, the girls know something's wrong. Emma's been crying all afternoon. Lily won't speak. They think you abandoned them, and please, is there anything you can say? Anything I can tell them that won't make this worse? Marcus stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the keyboard, trying to find words that would comfort without violating Chen's explicit instructions. Finally, he typed, "Tell them I'm sorry. Tell them it's not their fault. Tell them I didn't want to leave." He hit send and immediately regretted it, knowing these words would mean nothing to children who'd learned that adults left. That trust was dangerous. That opening yourself to care meant opening yourself to abandonment. 3 days passed in the fog of routine without purpose. Marcus worked his shifts, picked up. Ethan made dinners. Neither of them ate properly, stared at his phone, waiting for updates that didn't come. Victoria texted twice brief messages saying she was working on it, that lawyers were involved, that this would be resolved. Her confidence felt performative, whistling in the dark. On the fourth day, he was called back to the security office. Same room, same people, but the atmosphere had shifted. Chen looked uncomfortable now, and Ron Vasquez wouldn't meet his eyes. "Mr. Reed, we've completed our preliminary investigation." Chen's voice lacked the cold certainty from before. "We've interviewed Mrs. Sterling, reviewed your employment record, consulted with our legal team. We've found no evidence of wrongdoing on your part. However, there was always a however. However, given the sensitive nature of the situation, we're recommending that any future interactions with Mrs. Sterling's children take place with clear written protocols, documented supervision, and explicit approval from human resources. We're also recommending that these sessions, if they continue, take place somewhere other than Mrs. Sterling's private residence, perhaps in a neutral location where multiple adults are present." Marcus processed this, trying to understand what it meant in practical terms. "So I'm cleared. You're cleared, but we're establishing guidelines to protect everyone involved, for your protection as much as Mrs. Sterling's or her children's. Can I see them today?" Chen glanced at Vasquez, something passing between them that Marcus couldn't read. "That's between you and Mrs. Sterling. From the company's perspective, you're free to resume the arrangement under the new guidelines." Marcus left the office feeling like he'd won a fight that had cost more than victory was worth. He called Victoria from the hallway, his hands shaking with relief and residual anger and exhaustion from 4 days of worry. "I'm cleared. They're letting me come back." "Thank God." Victoria's voice cracked with emotion. "Can you come today?" "Now the girls, Marcus, they've been falling apart. They won't eat properly. Emma's having nightmares. Lily locked herself in her room yesterday and wouldn't come out for 6 hours. They think you're never coming back, think they did something to drive you away. I'll be there in an hour." But when Marcus arrived at Victoria's house 90 minutes later, delayed by having to pick up Ethan from school first, he found police cars in the driveway, lights flashing but no sirens. Their presence announcing crisis without declaring its nature. His chest tightened with immediate panic. He grabbed Ethan's hand and ran to the front door, which stood open, voices spilling from inside, tense and urgent. Victoria stood in the living room with 2 police officers, her face pale and streaked with tears, her hands shaking as she held her phone. She looked up when Marcus entered, and something in her expression broke further. "They're gone." Her voice was hollow. "Emma and Lily, they left a note saying they were going to find you. That was 3 hours ago. We can't find them anywhere." The world compressed to a single point of horror. Marcus's mind immediately went to worst-case scenarios, to children lost in a city that devoured the vulnerable, to traffic and strangers and all the dangers that multiplied when you were small and alone and driven by grief to desperate action. "Where have you looked?" "Everywhere. The school, the park, their friends' houses." Victoria gestured helplessly. "They don't know where you live. They don't know how to find you. They're out there somewhere, and it's raining, and they're probably terrified." One of the officers stepped forward, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a voice trained to project calm in crisis. "Sir, are you Marcus Reed?" "Yes. Mrs. Sterling said you've been working with her daughters. Is there anywhere they might have gone looking for you? Anywhere they associated with you?" Marcus thought frantically, running through the places they'd been together, but they'd only ever met. At this house had never gone anywhere that would give the girls a destination to seek. "Except Sterling Tower, the building where I work. There's a storage room where I first found Emma. She was hiding there when she was upset. She might have thought I'd be there." The officer nodded sharply, already reaching for her radio. "What floor?" 15. "Storage room 15C. They moved fast, then coordinating with officers already searching downtown, updating the search parameters. Victoria grabbed her keys and Marcus followed her to her car. Ethan silent in the back seat, sensing the urgency but not understanding it, his anxiety manifest in hand flapping that Marcus couldn't comfort right now, couldn't address when 2 8-year-old girls were missing in a city that didn't care about children who wandered off. Victoria drove too fast, ran 2 yellow lights, gripped the steering wheel so tight her knuckles went white. Marcus called Ron Vasquez from the car, explained the situation, asked him to check the storage room immediately, check everywhere on 15, check the whole building. "Already on it." Ron's voice was tense. "Got the call 5 minutes ago. We're searching now." The rain had started during the drive, November cold and heavy, the kind that soaked through clothes in minutes, that made visibility poor and streets slick in danger multiply. Marcus stared out the window at pedestrians hunched under umbrellas, at cars moving too fast for conditions at the city that contained his own son and two missing girls and more vulnerability than he could protect against. They reached Sterling Tower to find security vehicles blocking the main entrance, officers coordinating search teams the building on lockdown, while they swept floor by floor. Victoria parked illegally and ran for the entrance, Marcus right behind her with Ethan, all of them soaked by rain in the 30 seconds it took to reach the doors. Ron Vasquez met them in the lobby, his expression unreadable. "We found them." Victoria's knees buckled, and Marcus caught her elbow, holding her upright through the wave of relief that felt like drowning in reverse. "We're storage room 15C, just like Reed said." "They're okay, wet, cold, shaken up, but okay. We've got paramedics checking them now." They took the elevator to 15, Victoria shaking silently beside him. Marcus's own relief, warring with anger that anyone had let this happen, that a week of happiness had been destroyed by anonymous malice, that children had been driven to run away because adults couldn't stop hurting them with good intentions and bad implementations. The storage room was crowded with people when they arrived, paramedics, security guards, officers taking statements. Emma and Lily sat wrapped in emergency blankets on the floor, where Marcus had first found Emma crying. Their clothes soaked through their hair, plastered to their heads, their faces showing exhaustion and fear, and the particular devastation of hope that had failed. Emma saw Marcus first. Her face crumpled, and she started crying in earnest, the kind of sobs that shook her whole body, that came from someplace deep and primal, where all loss lived. Lily's reaction was quieter, but no less profound. Her eyes finding his and filling with tears, she was trying to hold back, trying to maintain some dignity in the face of complete emotional collapse. Victoria dropped to her knees in front of her daughters and pulled them both into her arms with a fierceness that was almost violent, holding them like she could physically prevent them from ever leaving again, like the strength of her grip could undo the fear of the last 3 hours. She was crying too, saying things that weren't quite words, sounds of relief and terror and love that language couldn't contain. Marcus hung back, giving them space for reunion, but Emma broke from her mother's embrace and stumbled toward him, her blanket falling away. She grabbed his hand with both of hers, holding so tight it hurt, and looked up at him with eyes that held accusation and relief in equal measure. "You left." Her voice was small and broken. "You left, and you didn't say why, and we thought you weren't coming back." The words hit harder than any physical blow. Marcus knelt down to her level, aware that a room full of people was watching, that paramedics were probably judging his response, that this moment mattered more than any that had come before. "I didn't want to leave. I was told I had to, and I should have found a way to explain, should have made sure you knew it wasn't your fault. I'm sorry I scared you. I'm sorry I made you feel abandoned." Emma threw her arms around his neck and held on like she was drowning, and he was the only solid thing left in the world. Lily joined them a moment later, her embrace more restrained, but equally desperate, and Marcus held both girls while they cried and tried to understand that some abandonment wasn't choice, was forced by systems and policies and people who thought they were protecting everyone, but ended up hurting the ones who needed protection most. Over their heads, he met Victoria's eyes. She was watching them with an expression he couldn't fully interpret, something raw and pained and maybe envious, that her daughter sought comfort from someone else first, that in the hierarchy of trust she'd fallen below a janitor they'd known for barely a week. But then she did something that changed everything. She crawled over to them, wrapped her arms around all three of them, made their tight circle wider to include herself, stopped being CEO, and became just a mother holding her children, thanking the man who'd helped her remember what that meant. "I forgot how to be their mother." Her voice was barely audible under the sounds of rain against windows, under the radio chatter of security, under the shuffling of paramedics packing equipment. "I was so busy trying to be strong that I forgot being present was more important than being perfect. You taught me that. 5 days of watching you with them taught me what 2 years of grief made me forget." The paramedics insisted on taking the girls to the hospital for observation, standard protocol for minors who'd been missing in dangerous conditions. Victoria rode in the ambulance, holding both their hands, and Marcus followed in his own car, with Ethan the boy silent and processing, understanding, perhaps, that the world contained more complexity than his mind easily organized, that people hurt each other without meaning to, That fear and love were often indistinguishable in their intensity. The hospital was bureaucratic and slow nurses taking vitals and asking questions and filling out forms, while Emma and Lily sat side by side in a bed still holding hands, still wrapped in blankets, even though they had been given dry clothes. They were diagnosed with mild hypothermia, exhaustion, dehydration. The doctor recommended they stay overnight for observation, but the girls refused to be separated from their mother, and Victoria's lawyer arrived at some point and made arguments about rights and necessity, and eventually arrangements were made for home monitoring instead. It was nearly midnight when they left the hospital. Victoria drove them all back to her house, Marcus and Ethan included, because somehow in the chaos they'd become a unit, a configuration of people who needed to stay together until crisis passed into something more manageable. The house was quiet and warm and felt safer than it had any right to feel after everything that had happened. Victoria made hot chocolate that no one drank and soup that no one ate, and finally gave up on feeding anyone. Let the children curl up together on the living room couch under blankets, while adults tried to figure out what came next. Marcus sat in the kitchen with Victoria, both of them too exhausted for words, but unable to separate, unable to go their own ways when everything felt too fragile to trust. James Hendrick filed the complaint. Victoria's voice was flat with certainty. He admitted it to me tonight, claimed he was protecting the company, protecting my children from someone with questionable judgment. He actually said those words. Questionable judgment. What did you tell him? That he's fired? That I'm calling an emergency board meeting tomorrow? That I'm done letting fear of judgment dictate how I protect my children? Marcus didn't know what to say, didn't know if board members could be fired or if that was even how corporate structure worked, but Victoria's determination was absolute. A woman who'd spent 2 years being careful and had decided that careful wasn't worth the cost. They sat in silence after that, listening to the quiet sounds of breathing from the living room to the rain that had finally stopped to the house settling around them. At some point, Marcus must have dozed because he startled awake to find Victoria shaking his shoulder gently. Dawnlight just starting to show through the windows. The kids are asleep. She gestured toward the living room where all 4 children had somehow ended up in a pile on the couch, tangled together in unconscious trust. You should get home. Get some real rest. We'll figure out the rest later. Marcus stood his back, protesting hours in an uncomfortable chair. He walked to the living room doorway and looked at the sleeping children one last time. Emma, with her head on Lily's shoulder. Lily with her hand resting on Ethan's arm. Ethan curled in a position that looked uncomfortable, but that clearly worked for him. 4 broken pieces that had somehow fit together into something whole. Tomorrow would bring complications. Tomorrow, Victoria would fight her board. Tomorrow, investigators would want statements. Tomorrow, life would return to its normal complexity. But tonight in this house, everyone was safe. Everyone was together. Everyone had survived. Sometimes that was enough. Morning came too early, sunlight harsh against eyes that had barely closed. Marcus woke on Victoria's couch with a crick in his neck and the disorientation of unfamiliar surroundings. The house was already awake, sounds from the kitchen suggesting breakfast attempts, children's voices layered over the clink of dishes. He found them all together. Victoria at the stove, burning eggs, Emma setting the table with mismatched plates, Lily pouring juice with concentration that suggested this task mattered deeply. Ethan sat at the table arranging silverware in precise patterns, creating order from chaos the only way he knew how. Victoria looked up when he entered, her face showing every hour of the sleepless night. There's coffee. It's terrible, but it's strong. Marcus poured himself a cup, the bitter taste grounding him in the present moment. His phone showed 6 missed calls from Bill Torres, 3 from Ron Vasquez, a text from Dr. Patel reminding him about Ethan's appointment he'd completely forgotten. Reality reasserting itself after the surreal intensity of the previous night. I need to call work. Marcus kept his voice low, aware the children were listening even when they pretended not to. Explain why I didn't show up for my shift. Already handled. Victoria slid eggs onto plates with the resignation of someone who'd stopped caring about culinary perfection. I called Bill at 6 this morning, explained the situation. You're cleared for the day. The eggs were indeed burnt, the toast barely warm, the juice too pulpy, but they ate together anyway, the meal's imperfection somehow making it more meaningful. This was what family looked like when you stopped performing. It stopped trying to make everything perfect, stopped hiding the broken parts. Emma pushed food around her plate without eating, her eyes red from crying, her movements subdued. Lily ate mechanically, each bite measured and time control maintained through ritual. Both girls kept glancing at Marcus like they needed visual confirmation he was still there, still real, still not planning to disappear. After breakfast, Victoria made calls from her study while Marcus helped the children clean up. He washed dishes at the sink, Ethan drying with careful attention, the twins putting things away in cabinets they could barely reach. Domestic tasks transformed into connection, the ordinary work of living together creating bonds that transcended words. Victoria emerged from her study looking grimmer than before. The board meeting is set for 11, emergency session. Hendricks already trying to spin this as evidence of my instability, saying I've been letting strangers have inappropriate access to my children. What are you going to say? The truth that my children were failing and I found someone who could help them. That Hendrick manufactured a crisis to undermine me. That I'm done letting fear dictate my parenting. Her voice carried steel Marcus hadn't heard before, the sound of someone who'd found the line they wouldn't cross, the place where protecting reputation mattered less than protecting what was real. The morning stretched long. Marcus should have left, should have taken Ethan home, returned to his own life, and let Victoria handle corporate warfare without civilian witnesses. But Emma asked him to stay in a voice so small he couldn't refuse, and Lily's silence somehow felt like the same request, and Victoria didn't contradict them. They sat in the living room and played games that required no talking, card games where Ethan's pattern recognition gave him unfair advantage. Drawing games where Emma's enthusiasm compensated for lack of skill, building games where Lily's precision created structures that stood. Time moved strangely, hours, feeling like minutes, anticipation making every moment heavy with what was coming. At 10:30, Victoria changed into a suit, transformed from mother back into CEO with costume and posture. She stood in front of the mirror in the hallway, adjusting her collar, and Marcus saw her hands shake slightly before she forced them steady. What if they vote me out? The question was directed at her reflection, not at him, but he answered anyway. Then you'll find another way. You'll still be their mother. That's the part that matters. She turned to look at him, really look at him, and something passed between them that felt like recognition. Like two people who'd both lost everything, understanding that what remained was enough to build on. Thank you for staying, for all of it. The words felt insufficient for what they were trying to carry, but Marcus nodded acceptance anyway. Victoria left for the board meeting and the house fell into anxious waiting. The children sensed something important was happening, grew quieter, moved closer to each other, and to Marcus, like proximity to adults could protect them from whatever came next. Emma asked the question they were all thinking, is Mom going to lose her job? Marcus chose honesty over comfort. She might. Some people think she made bad choices, but sometimes doing the right thing looks like making bad choices to people who care more about rules than about people. What happens to us if she loses her job? Lily's voice was steady, but her eyes were frightened, the practicality of grief teaching children to plan for worst-case scenarios before they happen. You'll still have each other. You'll still have your mom. Money and what other people think don't change what's real. The answer wasn't sufficient reassurance, but it was true, and Marcus had learned that children could handle truth better than well-meaning lies. At Sterling Tower, Victoria walked into the boardroom 15 minutes early. She wanted to see their faces before the performance began, wanted to watch Hendrick's confidence, wanted to remember this moment when she decided fear was more expensive than honesty. The board members filed in over the next 10 minutes, 7 men, 2 women, all of them wearing expensive suits and practiced expressions. Hendrick arrived last, his entrance time for maximum impact, his smile suggesting he thought he had already won. Victoria stood at the head of the table and waited for silence. When she spoke, her voice carried none of the uncertainty that churned beneath. I'm going to tell you a story. 2 years ago, my husband died. You all know this. What you don't know is that I've spent every day since trying to prove his death didn't break me, didn't make me weak, didn't compromise my ability to run this company. I worked longer hours, made harder decisions, showed no vulnerability because I thought vulnerability was the same as failure. She paused, meeting each board member's eyes in turn. In the process, I stopped being a mother. My daughters were grieving, and I hired professionals to fix them instead of being present myself. 12 tutors quit this year. 12, and I thought the problem was the tutors or my daughters or something I could solve by throwing money at it. Hendrick shifted in his seat. Mrs. Sterling, I'm not sure what this has to do with I'm not finished. The words cut sharp. 3 weeks ago, I found my daughter crying in a storage closet. A janitor, a man none of you have ever noticed, stayed with her when she needed someone. He didn't have a degree in child psychology. He didn't have training in behavioral management. He just had the decency to see a child in pain and not walk away. Murmurs around the table, board members exchanging glances. I hired him to spend time with my daughters, paid him out of my personal funds. And for the first time in 2 years, my children smiled. They played. They talked about their father without breaking down. They started healing because someone finally gave them permission to be broken without trying to fix them. Hendrik leaned forward, his voice dripping false concern. No one questions your intentions, Victoria, but you hired someone with a questionable history, someone investigated in relation to his wife's death, gave him unsupervised access to vulnerable children. Surely you can see how that's problematic. His wife died in a car accident. He was cleared of any wrongdoing, and he was never unsupervised. I was present, but you didn't file your complaint because you were worried about my children. You filed it because you thought it would give you ammunition to push me out. The room went silent. Hendrik's face flushed red. I have the documentation right here. Victoria placed a folder on the table. The timeline of your complaint matches exactly with your private conversations about calling for a vote of no confidence. Your concern for my children's welfare is remarkably convenient, given your 2-year campaign to replace me. She walked around the table slowly, her heels clicking against the floor. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to withdraw your complaint. You're going to apologize to Mr. Reed for the damage you've caused, and you're going to resign from this board. Today, Hendrik stood abruptly. You can't force me to resign. No, but I can make public every questionable decision you've made in the last 5 years. Every conflict of interest, every time you voted to benefit companies where your son-in-law holds positions. I've been documenting everything while you were busy trying to destroy me. The threat hung in the air, absolute and undeniable. Hendrik looked around the table for support, found none. Other board members were staring at their hands at their papers anywhere but at him. Victoria returned to her position at the head of the table. Furthermore, I'm implementing new policies. Every employee at this company, from executive to maintenance staff, will have access to mental health resources, grief counseling, support services. Because we're not machines, we're people, and people need help sometimes. She placed both hands flat on the table, leaning forward. My husband taught me something. I forgot. Strength isn't about being perfect. It's about admitting when you need help. I needed help. My daughters needed help. And we found it in someone this company considered invisible. That says more about our failures than his. One of the older board members, a woman named Patricia Chen, spoke for the first time. I move that we accept James Hendrik's resignation effective immediately. Second, another voicemail from the far end of the table. The vote was swift and unanimous. Hendrik left the boardroom without a word, his face a mask of controlled rage, his exit marking the end of his campaign and the beginning of something else. Victoria stayed after the others filed out, stood alone in the empty room, and let herself shake with the aftershocks of confrontation. She'd won, but victory felt less like triumph and more like finally putting down a weight she'd been carrying too long. Back at the house, Marcus's phone rang just after noon. Victoria's voice came through tight with emotion he couldn't identify. It's done. Hendrik's out. The board voted unanimously to support the new policies. It's over. Relief flooded through Marcus so intensely it felt physical. The children, who'd been sitting tensely nearby, visibly relaxed when they saw his face change. Emma started crying again, these tears different from before release rather than fear. Lily's shoulders dropped from the rigid posture she'd been holding her body, remembering how to exist without constant defensive tension. Victoria came home an hour later, walked through the door to find all 4 children waiting. They surrounded her immediately, Emma and Lily hugging her while Ethan hovered nearby, his presence offering support in the only way he knew how. Victoria held her daughters and cried, kind of abandon that only came when the performance finally ended, when you could stop being strong and just be human. That evening, after emotions had settled into exhaustion, they ordered pizza that arrived cold and ate it anyway, sitting in the living room with paper plates and paper towels, because no one had energy for real dishes. The conversation was lighter than it had been in weeks, the children's voices carrying relief and something that might have been hope. Ethan wrote in his notebook and showed Emma a drawing, five stick figures holding hands. She smiled and added her own addition flowers around their feet. Sun overhead, the visual language of happiness that children spoke fluently. Marcus knew he should take Ethan home, reestablish boundaries, return to the careful distance between employer and employee, between helper and helped. But Victoria asked them to stay for a movie, her voice making it clear this wasn't optional, that today everyone needed to exist together in the same space to confirm through proximity that they'd all survived. They made it through half the movie before the children fell asleep, exhaustion finally claiming them. Marcus carried Ethan to the guest room Victoria indicated, laid his son down, still fully clothed, covered him with a blanket, and watched him sleep with the particular ache of love that parenthood brought. Victoria stood in the doorway behind him. "You can take my room. I'll sleep with the girls tonight. They'll need me close." The next several weeks brought careful negotiation of new normal. Marcus continued coming to Victoria's house 3 afternoons a week, the arrangement now formalized with written agreements that satisfied HR's requirements for documentation. The sessions moved to a neutral location on 2 of those days, a community center conference room Victoria rented that felt institutional and wrong, but they made it work because compliance mattered in its own way. The children continued healing in increments so small they were only visible in retrospect. Emma started talking about her father without crying, every time sharing memories that made her smile instead of breaking down. Lily began asking questions about Marcus's wife, about how he'd survived loss, about whether the pain ever really stopped, or if you just learned to carry it differently. Ethan made his own progress, speaking his first word in 3 years during an afternoon at Victoria's house. The word was Emma's name, barely audible, but she'd dropped something and he'd said it instinctively, wanting to help, and the room had frozen in recognition of something profound shifting. Victoria became a different kind of present in her daughters' lives, cutting back work hours, saying no to evening meetings, remembering that executive success meant nothing if her children were failing. She learned to make lunches that looked like Marcus's, learned the comfort of simple routine, learned that love was less about grand gestures and more about showing up consistently, even when you were tired. 6 months passed, winter turning to early spring. Marcus was mopping the ground floor of Sterling Tower when a woman approached, clearly looking for someone specific. She was young professional carrying a tablet in that particular intensity of someone on a mission. "Excuse me, are you Marcus Reed?" He nodded, uncertain, his gut tightening with the instinct that strangers asking his name usually brought complications. "I'm Sarah Chen from the Times. I'm writing a piece about Victoria Sterling and the new employee wellness programs at Sterling Enterprises. I was hoping to interview you about your role in their implementation." Marcus felt panic rising. "I don't have any role. I'm just maintenance staff, Mrs. Sterling told me you were instrumental in helping her recognize the need for these changes. She said you taught her that everyone in an organization matters, that janitorial staff have as much value as executives, that wellness shouldn't be dependent on salary level." "That's not," Marcus struggled with words. "I just helped her daughters. That's all." The reporter smiled. "That's the story. How helping 2 children changed an entire company's culture. Would you be willing to talk about it?" Marcus gave her 10 minutes, uncomfortable with attention, with the idea that his private actions might become public narrative. But he talked about grief, about how loss didn't discriminate by income, about how Ethan taught him that different wasn't broken, about how the twins had taught him that healing required presence more than expertise. The article ran 2 weeks later. Marcus bought the paper at the bodega on his way to work. Read it on the subway with growing discomfort at seeing his words in print, at the way the reporter had made him sound noble when he'd just been surviving, just been doing what needed doing. Victoria called him that afternoon. "Have you seen it? Yeah, you sound upset. It makes it seem like I did something special." "I didn't. I just showed up." "Marcus," her voice carried weight, "that is what was special. Showing up when no one else did. Being present when presence was the only thing that mattered. That's everything." The article brought unexpected attention. Reporters wanted follow-ups. Other companies asked Victoria to speak about her wellness initiatives. Marcus's face appeared in photographs accompanying stories about corporate transformation, about prioritizing humanity over profit, about recognizing that every person in an organization carried struggles worth acknowledging. He hated most of it in the intrusion into privacy, the way strangers now recognized him at work, the uncomfortable praise from people who seemed to think kindness was remarkable instead of baseline. But Emma and Lily loved the article, cut it out, and hung it on their refrigerator, pointed to Marcus's photograph with pride that felt too large for what he'd done. 3 months after the article ran on a Saturday afternoon in late May, Emma asked Marcus to wait in the living room while she and Lily retrieved something from upstairs. The girls had been secretive all week, whispering together, exchanging glances that suggested conspiracy. They came back carrying a box wrapped in paper they'd clearly decorated themselves, covered in drawings of stick figures and dinosaurs and hearts. Emma held it out with ceremony, her face showing the nervous excitement of a gift giver, uncertain of reception. "We made you something." Lily's voice was steady, but her eyes were anxious. "For Ethan's lunches." Marcus opened the box, carefully aware that whatever was inside mattered more than the object itself. A lunchbox, plain blue metal, but decorated with paintings that covered every surface. Not the clumsy work of children, but careful, detailed art that had taken hours. One side showed 5 figures holding hands, 2 tall, 3 small, everyone connected. Another side showed a building that was clearly Sterling Tower, with a small figure in blue uniform carrying a mop. The lid showed a family around a table, eating together, the scene domestic and warm, and impossibly specific in its details. Above all the images, in careful block letters, a message: "Thank you for seeing us." And in smaller writing below, in what looked like Victoria's handwriting, "Thank you for letting us see you too." Marcus's throat closed. He ran his fingers over the painted surface, the layers of care embedded in every brushstroke, the love made visible in metal and paint, and time spent creating something meaningful. "We want you to use it," Emma's voice was anxious. "For Ethan's lunches, so you remember us every day. I could never forget you." The words came out rough, honest, carrying weight that formal language couldn't hold. He pulled both girls into a hug, felt them hold on tight, felt the full circle of care that had started with a crying child in a storage room and had grown into something that looked like family, even though none of them shared blood. That night, Marcus sat at his kitchen table and filled the new lunchbox for Monday's lunch. He arranged the food with the same care he'd learned from Sarah, the same attention to detail that transformed necessity into expression of love. Sandwich cut in precise squares, apple sliced thin, crackers forming a smiling face. But this time the face seemed different, seemed to carry something beyond the mechanical comfort of routine. This time it felt like promise, like forward motion, like proof that grief could coexist with joy, that loss could make space for new connection without betraying what had been. He placed the lunchbox next to Sarah's photograph on the kitchen table, the old and new sitting together without contradiction. For 3 years he'd been frozen, holding his wife's memory so tight there was no room for anything else. But Emma and Lily and Victoria had taught him that opening your hands didn't mean letting go, that making space for new love didn't diminish old love, that healing meant expansion rather than replacement. The photograph looked different now. Or maybe he looked different. Or maybe the relationship between memory and present had shifted in ways that made both possible. Sarah would have liked these girls, would have appreciated Victoria's fierce protection of her children, would have recognized in Marcus's care for them the same instincts she'd cultivated in him years ago. He whispered to the photograph, "First time in months, I think I'm okay now. Not healed, but okay. And that feels like enough." 1 year after that first afternoon at Victoria's house, they all gathered to celebrate Emma and Lily's 9th birthday. The party was small. The twins, Ethan, Victoria, Marcus, and a handful of school friends who'd slowly become comfortable around children who were different but no longer defined by their difference. They ate cake that Victoria had baked herself, lopsided and imperfect and delicious in its honest effort. They played games in the backyard where the girls had once raked leaves and learned that work could be shared joy. They sang off-key and laughed at stupid jokes and existed together in the ordinary miracle of people who'd found each other through brokenness and chosen to stay. Later, after the friends had left and the children were playing upstairs, Marcus and Victoria sat on the back porch watching the sun set. A year ago, he would never have imagined this, sitting comfortably with a billionaire CEO, their children upstairs, creating noise that sounded like childhood talking about nothing important, because nothing important needed saying. Victoria broke the comfortable silence. "I've been thinking about something you said that first day in my office. about how maybe my daughters weren't acting out. Maybe they were just trying to be seen. I think we're all just trying to be seen. Every person who walks through Sterling Towers' doors, from the executives to the maintenance staff, we're all carrying something. We're all hoping someone will notice, will care, will acknowledge that we matter beyond our utility. Marcus nodded. That's why the lunchboxes work. It's not about the food. It's about someone taking time to arrange it, to make it special, to show that they see you as more than just someone who needs feeding. Victoria smiled, the expression carrying weight of understanding earned through pain. You taught me that. You taught me that the most important work isn't done in boardrooms. It's done in storage rooms and kitchens, in quiet moments when someone chooses presence over efficiency. They sat in silence after that, watching the sky turn from blue to orange to purple, listening to the sounds of children who'd learned that broken things could form new patterns, that families could be built from fragments, that love didn't require perfection, just persistence. Inside, Emma helped Ethan with a puzzle while Lily read aloud from a book, her voice carrying through the open window. The scene was ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of moment that didn't seem significant except to the people living it, to the people who remembered when ordinary had seemed impossible. Marcus thought about the journey that had brought them here, about the crying girl in the storage room, about the anonymous complaint that almost destroyed everything, about the rain-soaked children who'd run away looking for connection they thought they'd lost. He thought about all the small choices that had accumulated into transformation, choosing to stay instead of leave, choosing honesty over safety, choosing to open his hands and let new people in. The light was fading now, day giving way to evening, and Marcus knew he should take Ethan home soon, re-establish the boundaries between visit and invasion. But Victoria touched his arm lightly. Stay for dinner. It's just leftovers and frozen pizza, but stay anyway. He stayed, because healing wasn't a destination you reached and then stopped. It was continuous motion, continuous choice, continuous showing up even when you were tired, even when the work seemed small and insignificant, even when no one was watching to acknowledge your effort. The most important work in the world wasn't done in boardrooms or corner offices. It was done in kitchens, making lunchboxes at dawn. It was done in living rooms where children learned to trust again. It was done in quiet moments when broken people held space for each other's pain without trying to fix it. It was done by people who understood that sometimes the person who saves you is the one you never saw at all, and sometimes saving someone means simply being present, being patient, being the person who shows up consistently with a lunchbox and a careful heart, and the quiet belief that love looks like showing up every single day, through grief and joy and ordinary moments and crisis and all the accumulated weight of being human together. The building was quiet now. The lights on the 15th floor had been dimmed, but in a house across town, 5 people sat down to dinner together, and for this one moment, everyone was home.